You might not think about it when you're ordering, say, a plate of shrimp or some grilled fish, but the sheer scale of the global seafood market is kind of staggering.
Oh, absolutely.
The shrimp market alone, we're talking over US $20 billion every year.
Huge numbers.
And with that much seafood moving around, well, you have to wonder what unseen things might be coming along for the ride.
Exactly. And that's really why we're taking a close look today, doing a deep dive into a specific scientific study.
Okay.
It's titled Evaluation of Heavy Metals and Their Potential Risk to Human Health from Seafood in Escravos Estuary, Southern Nigeria. It was published in the Marine Pollution Bulletin.
Got it. So this isn't just, an opinion piece. This is real research.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly did these scientists look into?
Well, they did a really detailed analysis of this place, the Escravos Estuary. They collected samples of 3 key things.
Which were?
The sediment, the mud at the bottom, then the pink shrimp, Penaeus nochialis is the scientific name that lived there, and also the silver catfish, Chrysixis nigrodigitatus, which is a fish commonly eaten by people in that region.
Right. So our goal today, for you listening, is really to pull out the most important findings from this study.
Mm-hmm.
We want to understand what these heavy metals are doing in this environment and, maybe most importantly, what the potential dangers are for people eating seafood from this area.
Yeah.
We're aiming to make this clear, pretty straightforward, no advanced degree needed.
Exactly. And to really get the findings, we first need a picture of the place. The Escravos Estuary, where is it? It's in southern Nigeria.
Okay.
And it's a really vital waterway, a major route for commercial shipping, but also just local transport, people getting around.
So a busy place then. And I guess there's probably more than just boats going on there.
You're right. This area is also a significant hub for oil and gas production, petrochemical plants, that sort of thing. Plus, you've got a lot of artisanal fishing happening too. So it's this mix,
Mm-hmm.
Industry and traditional ways of life all in the same spot.
Which probably means stuff ends up in the water.
Inevitably, yeah. Some level of waste is going into the estuary.
The study mentions 2 specific communities where they took samples.
Yep.
Kurudi and Okarenkoko. Any reason for those 2?
Yeah, they picked those islands because they have relatively larger populations compared to other places along the estuary.
Ah, okay. So understanding the risk there is particularly relevant.
Precisely. And it's also worth noting, this estuary has important mangrove ecosystems, super crucial for coastal protection, and they act as nurseries for lots of marine life.
Okay, so we've got this picture. Busy estuary, industry, fishing, mangroves. Now, the contaminants. Heavy metals. Yeah. What are they exactly, and where might they come from in Nigeria?
Right, so heavy metals are natural elements, but they become a problem when their concentrations go up because of human activities.
Okay.
In Nigeria, potential sources, well, the oil and gas industry is a big one. Also mining, agrochemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, and various manufacturing processes.
And this study looked at 4 specific ones.
Yes. Cadmium CD, chromium CR, copper Q, and lead PB.
Cadmium, chromium, copper, lead. Not exactly things you want on your dinner plate. Why are these 4 such a concern?
Well, they're worrisome because they can be toxic, both to aquatic life and to us, even in pretty small amounts.
How so?
They can mess with biological processes. And importantly, they tend to accumulate in living things over time. Bioaccumulation.
Right, building up.
Yeah, potentially leading to a whole range of health issues down the line.
Okay, so the researchers started at the bottom, literally, analyzing the sediment in Kurudi and Okarenkoko. What did that show?
It was interesting. While the average levels of most metals were generally a bit higher in the sediment from Okarenkoko, when they ran the stats, the difference wasn't actually significant for chromium, copper, and lead between the 2 sites.
Meaning?
It kind of suggests that similar activities are probably contributing these metals across this part of the estuary, but cadmium was the exception.
Cadmium again.
Yeah, there was a statistically significant difference in cadmium concentration between Kurudi and Okarenkoko sediments.
That seems important. So mostly similar impact on the sediment, except for cadmium. How did these levels compare to, say, safety guidelines?
They compared them to standards from both Nigeria EGASPIN and the US EPA. The sort of good news is that for most of the metals, the levels they found were below the permissible limits set by these guidelines.
Okay, that's something.
But cadmium, again, it exceeded the target values in some samples.
So even if the immediate risk to bottom dwellers seems low for most metals, that cadmium level is definitely a flag. And they stress continued monitoring, right?
Precisely. Even if current risks seem limited, apart from maybe cadmium, you've got increasing industrial activity, things could get worse.
Right.
Sediment acts like a sink, a storage bank for these metals, so long-term buildup is a real concern. You can't just ignore it.
Okay, let's move up the food chain then. The pink shrimp. What about them?
In the shrimp, the pattern was a bit different. Okra and cocoa generally had higher concentrations of all 4 heavy metals compared to crudy shrimp.
All 4?
Yeah, and the differences for chromium, copper, and lead were statistically significant, meaning it's unlikely just random chance.
So the shrimp and okra and cocoa seem to be getting a bigger dose.
It looks that way. It suggests they're being exposed to different levels of these contaminants in the 2 locations.
That's interesting, especially since the sediment was more similar for most metals. Any ideas why the shrimp would be different?
Well, the researchers suggest one possibility. Shrimp move around, right?
Sure.
So maybe the shrimp caught in Carudi and okra and cocoa actually came from different parts of the estuary originally, areas with different contamination levels.
Makes sense. And they compared these findings to other studies, too.
They did, yeah. Looking at similar shrimp species in other parts of Nigeria, places like Buguma Creek, Lagos Lagoon, and also internationally, like the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Mexico, it helps put their results in context.
Absolutely. Gives you that broader picture. What about the specific metals in the shrimp? Was one particularly high?
Copper. It had the highest concentration in the shrimp from both places.
Copper. Any reason why?
It could be because copper is actually an essential nutrient for these animals, for biological processes. So maybe they actively take up more of it.
Okay. An essential element, but too much is still bad.
Exactly. The overall order of concentration they found in okra and cocoa shrimp was copper, then chromium, then cadmium, then lead.
And the crucial question, how did these shrimp levels stack up against safety limits for eating them?
Right, so they compared the concentrations to both Nigerian limits, FMNV, and international ones, FAO-WHO Codex.
Then the verdict.
Not great, actually. The levels of copper and chromium exceeded those limits, and cadmium also exceeded the FAO-WHO guidelines.
Whoa. So even in the shrimp, multiple metals were above the recommended safe levels for consumption.
Yes, which raises concerns, not just for the health of the shrimp population itself, but also potential risks for people eating them.
Right. So even though, as we'll get to, the final risk assessment for shrimp consumption seemed lower, finding these exceedances in the shrimp themselves is definitely a warning sign about the ecosystem's health.
Absolutely. It's a clear indicator something's off.
Okay, let's move on to the silver catfish. This fish eats shrimp, among other things. What did the study find in them?
They looked at metal levels in different parts of the catfish, the muscle, which is what people usually eat,
Right.
but also gills, gonads, liver, and sort of the rest of the fish bones, head, organs.
And the pattern, similar to shrimp.
Similar in that okra and cocoa generally had higher levels than Carudi again.
Okay. And within the fish itself, where did the metals build up most?
There was a general pattern. Highest concentrations tended to be in that rest of the fish category.
Makes sense, bones and organs.
Yeah. Then the gills, then muscle, then liver, and the gonads usually had the lowest levels. This distribution often reflects how different tissues handle these metals, their function.
Got it. And what about the overall concentration of each metal? Was the order the same as in shrimp?
Interestingly, no. In the whole catfish and most tissues, the order was generally chromium highest, then cadmium, then lead, then copper.
Chromium highest in the fish. That's different.
It is. And again, they compared this to other studies on silver catfish in Nigeria Lagos, Brass Estuary, and found variations. It could be down to differences in where the fish live, what else they eat.
So the catfish seem to be accumulating a different mix, or at least different proportions, compared to the shrimp. How did their levels compare to the safety limits for human consumption?
This is where it gets quite worrying. The comparison showed that levels of cadmium, chromium, and lead in the silver catfish exceeded the national and international recommended limits.
3 out of 4 again.
Yes. Cadmium, chromium, and lead were all over the limits. Copper was the only one that wasn't.
Wow. That's a serious concern, especially since you said this catfish is commonly eaten there.
It really is. It points to a much higher potential for people to be exposed to these contaminants by eating this particular fish.
Definitely painting a concerning picture for catfish consumers, especially from okra and cocoa, it seems. Now, the study also looked at bioaccumulation and trophic transfer. Explain those a bit. They're about how pollutants move up the food web, right?
Exactly. So first, the biota-sediment accumulation factor, BSAF, that basically tells us how good the shrimp are at picking up metals from the sediment they live in.
Okay.
In Kurudi, they found high BSAF values for cadmium, copper, and chromium, meaning shrimp there seem pretty efficient at accumulating those metals from the sediment.
Right.
In Okurenkoko, it was high for copper and chromium, but lower for cadmium and lead. So it suggests the relationship between sediment levels and shrimp uptake isn't the same everywhere in the estuary. It varies.
So some metals get soaked up from the mud more easily than others, and it even differs by location. What about the next step? Trophic transfer factor, TTF. How much gets passed from shrimp to the catfish that eat them?
Generally, the TTF values were low, mostly less than 1. Meaning there isn't a very efficient transfer of most metals from the shrimp to the catfish. It doesn't seem to magnify much as it goes up that specific step.
Okay, so it doesn't biomagnify much between those two.
For most metals, no. The exception was chromium in Kurudi. Its TTF was greater than 1.
So chromium did biomagnify from shrimp to catfish in Kurudi.
It suggests that, yes, for chromium in that location. However, the researchers are careful to point out that the high levels in catfish might not just be from eating shrimp. They eat other things, they might roam over wider areas, or they could even absorb metals directly from the water.
Right. It's complex. Multiple potential pathways for the catfish.
Exactly. It's not just one simple food chain link.
Okay, this brings us to maybe the most critical part. The human health risk assessment.
Yeah.
How do they figure out the danger to people eating this seafood?
They use 2 main calculations. First, the estimated daily intake, EDI, basically how much contaminant you might eat per day from the seafood. And second, the hazard ratio, or HR. This compares that daily intake to a level considered safe, a reference dose.
And the magic number is 1.
Pretty much. If the hazard ratio is greater than 1, it suggests a potential health risk. Below 1, less immediate concern based on these calculations.
Got it. So what did they find for people eating the pink shrimp?
For the shrimp, both from Kurudi and Okurenkoko, the hazard ratios for both adults and children were less than 1.
Okay.
Which suggests that, based on the metal levels in shrimp and estimated eating habits, there isn't an immediate significant health risk calculated from eating the shrimp.
That's somewhat reassuring then, for the shrimp eaters at least.
It is, relatively speaking.
But we already know the catfish had higher metal levels. What did the risk assessment show there?
Yeah, the findings for silver catfish were much more concerning, especially for Okurenkoko.
Okay, let's break it down. Kurudi first.
In Kurudi catfish, most hazard ratios for adults and children eating either the muscle or the whole fish were below 1 but.
There's a but.
Cadmium. The HR for cadmium was greater than 1 for both adults and children.
So even in Kurudi, eating catfish poses a potential health risk specifically from cadmium.
That's what the calculation suggests, yes. A reason to be concerned even there.
But you said Okurenkoko is worse.
Yes, significantly worse. In Okurenkoko catfish, the hazard ratios for cadmium and chromium and lead in both muscle and whole fish were substantially greater than 1 for both adults and children.
Wow. Cadmium, chromium, and lead all above the risk threshold.
Yes. Really indicating a considerable, potentially immediate health risk from eating silver catfish caught near Okurenkoko, and the risk is flagged as especially high for children.
Why children specifically?
They're generally more vulnerable because of their smaller body weight and developing systems. The same amount of contaminant has a bigger impact.
That's genuinely alarming, and it really highlights this stark difference in risk between 2 places in the same estuary, not even that far apart.
It really does. It underscores how localized pollution sources can create these hot spots of risk.
What kind of health problems are we talking about with these metals? Cadmium, lead, chromium.
Well, the paper touches on this. Elevated cadmium is linked to things like high blood pressure, heart issues, problems with bones, kidney dysfunction.
Okay.
Lead exposure can cause appetite loss, headaches, hypertension, and with chronic exposure, serious neurological problems.
My good.
And chromium can interfere with important chemical balances in the body, enzyme functions. They also briefly note these metals could be harming the fish populations themselves, not just the people eating them.
That really drives home why this research matters so much. It's not abstract pollution, it's people's health.
Absolutely.
The study also put its findings in context, comparing them to other areas, right? What was the takeaway there?
They found, that heavy metal levels do vary quite a bit across different coastal areas in Nigeria and globally.
Okay.
They suggest that maybe the presence of similar industries like petrochemicals and shipping, which are common in the Niger Delta, might explain some similarities in sediment contamination patterns across the region.
But the Escravos Estuary had its own specific profile.
It seems so. It looks like localized activities, both industrial and just general human activity,
Sure.
are really key drivers of the specific contamination levels found there.
The study mentions it focused on sediment in seafood, not surface water testing. Is that a gap?
Well, while water testing could add another layer of data, they make a strong point that sediment is crucial
Why is that?
because it acts as this long-term reservoir for the contaminants.
Yeah.
Especially for species like shrimp and catfish living on or near the bottom.
You have constant contact.
Exactly. And metals in the sediment can get stirred back up into the water column anyway, so analyzing the sediment gives really critical insight into the ongoing persistent risk in that ecosystem.
Okay, that makes sense. Sediment is key for the long-term picture. So pulling it all together, what are the main recommendations coming out of this research?
They strongly recommend, first off, more vigilance from regulatory bodies, regular monitoring of coastal activities, and critically, seafood safety.
Makes sense.
And given the really significant risks they found, particularly around ochre and cocoa,
Yeah.
they're calling for much stricter enforcement of environmental regulations. Industries releasing wastewater there need to comply, seriously comply.
Needs teeth behind the rules.
Absolutely. And they also stress the need to figure out and manage the non-point sources pollution that isn't coming from a single pipe, like agricultural runoff, general urban runoff. Those need tackling, too.
So the big takeaway seems to be seafood from the Escravos Estuary, especially that silver catfish from near ochre and cocoa, shows some really concerning levels of heavy metals. Potential health risks are real, particularly for kids.
That's the bottom line, yes.
Shrimp seems less risky based on this assessment, but still needs watching because the levels did exceed some guidelines in the shrimp tissue itself.
Exactly. Continuous monitoring is still really important, even for the shrimp.
And that aha moment for me is really the stark difference in risk between crudy and ochre and cocoa.
Right. It's quite striking. Two locations, relatively close, but very different risk profiles. It just hammers home how localized pollution impacts can be.
It definitely makes you, think a bit more carefully about where your seafood comes from and all the invisible factors tangled up in our food chains.
Mm-hmm.
And it raises that bigger question too, doesn't it? What are the responsibilities here? Industries, governments, ensuring seafood safety.
Absolutely. And it leaves you wondering, what else do we need to know? What further research is needed to really grasp the long-term effects of this contamination, not just on the Niger Delta's ecosystems, which are clearly fragile,
Right.
but also on the health and well-being of the people who live there and depend on these waters. It's this really complex knot of industrial development, environmental health, and human health that, it needs serious ongoing attention.